We all know that Christmas is supposed to be the most wonderful time of the year. That's why it's particularly disturbing when awful crimes take place over the holidays. Today, I'm going to be sharing two such stories with you. These are cases where, instead of sharing Christmas cheer, people found themselves in the middle of a real-life nightmare. That being said, I hope all of you out there are having a safe and happy holiday. And with that out of the way, let's get into today's stories. On Christmas Eve of 2011, 26-year-old Zazelle Preston had plenty to celebrate. She was the proud mother of two young girls, she was doing well in college, and she had big dreams for her future. She had also just welcomed a new addition to her family, a 7-week-old baby boy. The moment was especially sweet because Zazelle's life had not been an easy one. Growing up, she never knew her father, and though she was always surrounded by a large and loving family, her living situation had often been chaotic. At various points as a child, she lived with her mom, her aunt, a brother, and her grandparents. So it meant a lot to Zazelle to be able to provide a stable home for her children, and it was something that she had worked hard to do. While sitting in her apartment wrapping presents that evening, Zazelle reflected on how far she'd come. Her two daughters were now 8 and 3 years old, and they were growing up so fast. She'd raised both of them mostly by herself, which, as you might imagine, had been very challenging. But she had hopes that things would be different from here on out. The father of Zazelle's newborn son, 30-year-old William Wallace, was now living with her and her two girls at their apartment in Anaheim, California. Now, William and Zazelle had been with each other on and off for about 3 years, but over that time, their relationship had been far from perfect. In fact, previously, there had been a lot of abuse, specifically on the part of William towards Zazelle. However, recently, it seemed that William and Zazelle had been able to reconcile their relationship. When William found out that Zazelle was pregnant a few months earlier, they had arranged to meet up. He explained that he had become a Christian, had done a lot of soul-searching, and really wanted to be a father. Zazelle believed him and decided to give him another chance. As a sign of this new chapter, they had even gotten married in November, right before their son was born. So, in many ways, this was a Christmas of firsts. Zazelle and William's first holiday as a married couple, their first Christmas with their baby boy, and the first Christmas season they would all be spending together as a new family. After wrapping all of the gifts and placing them under the tree, Zazelle, William, and the three kids headed out to spend the evening together. They had been invited to a Christmas Eve party at one of their neighbors' places, and a bunch of people from their complex were also going to be there. By all accounts, it was a fun and festive evening, and everyone had a good time. Later that night, several people would hear some strange noises, mostly banging and what sounded like yelling, though at the time they assumed that this was probably just leftover stuff from the party. Unfortunately, they would soon learn that this was not the case. The following day, so December 25th, Zazelle's two daughters did exactly what you would expect for two young kids on Christmas morning. They got out of bed as soon as they woke up and immediately ran to see what Santa had brought them. Waiting for the girls in the living room were Zazelle and William, who were sitting on the couch with their baby brother. Before long, they were allowed to start opening up their presents. Now, in the anticipation and excitement of all of the gifts, initially all of this seemed totally normal, but pretty soon the girls started to notice that something was off. Their mom wasn't really reacting to anything that was going on, no matter how much they tried to show off the things that they had opened. She was also wearing this large pair of sunglasses, which also seemed pretty weird. Eventually, the girls asked William, what's going on with Mommy? Why isn't she having a good time? That's when William explained, well, Mommy ruined Christmas. She got too drunk at the party last night, and she ruined Christmas. William told the girls that it was okay, though, and that they should just go ahead and finish opening up their presents. This continued for a while, until William got up and left the room. After he did, he began making a series of phone calls. The final call he made was around 9:30 that morning. It was to 911. When paramedics arrived at the apartment, they found Zazelle still sitting on the couch, but by now she was completely slumped over. She didn't have a hangover, though. She was dead, and she had been that entire time. So, at some point between leaving the Christmas Eve party the previous night and early the next morning, William and Zazelle had gotten into a heated argument. We don't know what that argument was about or how it started, but what we do know is what came next. William viciously beat Zizelle. The banging and yelling sounds that neighbors had heard were the sounds of that attack. At this point, it's not clear if Zizelle was alive or dead yet, but she definitely wasn't conscious. And instead of trying to seek help or medical attention, William took her body into their bedroom. He waited until morning, when Zizelle definitely was dead, then dragged her body into the living room. In an attempt to cover up what had happened, he propped her up on the couch and put sunglasses on her before her daughters woke up, to trick them into thinking she was watching them open their Christmas presents. William would eventually try to claim that what had happened was an accident, and that Zizelle had died from drunkenly falling into a glass table. But by this point, he had already given too many conflicting accounts to too many different people. During those phone calls I mentioned before he called 911, William confessed to several of Zizelle's family members that he had gotten physical with her. Chillingly, he went as far as to admit in one of those conversations that Zizelle had managed to escape the apartment during the attack, but that he had caught her, pulled her back inside, and continued beating her. He only called authorities after Zizelle's family members begged him to. Evidence at the scene was also far more consistent with a violent attack than an accident. There was blood throughout the home, holes punched in walls, and a door was even ripped off its hinges. Then, of course, there was William's previous history of domestic violence. I told you before that William was abusive, but I didn't really delve into the details. Well, this was far from the first time that something like this had happened. William was extremely jealous and controlling, and almost anything Zizelle did could set him off. He had been arrested multiple times for attacking her, including at least one instance when she was pregnant. During that incident, a family member had found her lying in the fetal position out on the street. Despite William's disgusting behavior, it was like he had this power over Zizelle. No matter what he did, he could always talk his way back into her life. This is exactly what had happened in the months before Christmas. That meeting I told you about that Zizelle and William had about their son, it was while William was in jail for assaulting her. Still, when he got out, he managed to convince her that he had changed. Not only that, he got her to marry him. Zizelle's family tried everything they could think of to get her to leave William for good. And in the weeks leading up to her murder, it seemed like they were actually getting through to her. And this is where I have to mention one of the other great tragedies of this case, which is that the program Zizelle was in at Cypress College was a domestic violence program. Her dream was actually to become a counselor and to help other women who had gone through what she had experienced. In fact, the breakthrough moment Zizelle's family had with her was when they sat her down and had her read an excerpt from one of her own papers that she had written. That paper outlined the very cycle she was in, from denial to escalation to reconciliation. I think this is what makes Zizelle's story such a powerful example of the extent to which domestic violence is extremely complicated and has such a huge psychological component to it. From an academic standpoint, you can know all of the facts and the figures, the warning signs and the risks, but for many people, it's still not enough to get out before it's too late. William was arrested the same day all of this was discovered, though for reasons that aren't clear, it took more than 9 years for the case to finally go to trial. When it did, he was convicted of second-degree murder and sentenced to 15 years to life in prison. Because of his credit for time served, he was eligible for parole in 2023, though according to the most recent information we could find, that was denied. He will not be eligible again until November of 2028. According to news reports, after the murder, Zizelle's children were raised by members of her family. On December 26, 2007, a resident in the city of Frisco, Texas, was having a quiet night in. It was that lull between Christmas and New Year's where not much of anything normally happens, and the homeowner was enjoying a little time with family. That was until about 7:30 p.m. That's when the stillness of the neighborhood was shattered by terrifying noises from outside. It was followed, moments later, by ringing and pounding at the homeowner's front door. The female resident opened up to see what was happening and was greeted by an absolutely horrifying sight. A woman she didn't know was standing on her doorstep. She was in a state of complete panic, and her face and head were covered in blood.
Frisco 911.
A lady just rang our doorbell and said that somebody shot her.
What happened?
They shot me in the hand.
Who shot you?
I don't know. Some man.
Do you know who shot her?
Somebody that's still in her house.
Okay, what happened to the other man? Was that her boyfriend?
Craig, he was in the house when I left. He was screaming.
The woman's name was Teresa Johnson, and she had just been shot 3 times. 2 of the bullets had hit her in the head. However, when emergency responders arrived minutes later, she was still conscious and talking. Despite her grievous injuries, there was only one thing on her mind. She kept saying that police needed to get to her boyfriend, 36-year-old Craig Nale. As Teresa was airlifted to a hospital in Dallas, officers made their way to Craig's house, which was just a few properties over from where the 911 call had been made. When police entered, they found the place unnervingly quiet, though it quickly became clear that something incredibly violent had happened here. There was blood all over the floor, and .22 caliber shell casings were scattered everywhere. Strangely, there were also random bits of cotton in several places. Most of the blood was concentrated in the kitchen, but officers noticed a trail that appeared to lead out and towards a set of stairs. They followed the trail up to the master bedroom, where they made another awful discovery. Craig Nale was dead on the floor of his walk-in closet. He had been shot 10 times and was lying right on top of a bag that contained several guns and boxes of ammunition. These were different from the .22 caliber bullets that had killed him. Craig had clearly been trying to defend himself, but sadly, he never got the chance. There was also no sign of the shooter anywhere. Detectives had a difficult time knowing what to make of the situation. This didn't look like a typical home invasion robbery, as nothing was missing from the house. Instead, it appeared that Craig had been chased through his home by a determined attacker, one who hadn't stopped until they were sure that he was dead. Craig was the last person who anyone would have expected to die in such a brutal way. He wasn't involved in any illegal or risky activities. He was a successful senior system engineer at a security software company and was a proud and devoted single father. He had 2 daughters from previous relationships, and his life revolved around taking care of them. All of it begged the question, who could have done this and why? Investigators got their first real lead when they received an unexpected call. It was from the hospital in Dallas. Miraculously, Teresa Johnson had survived. After getting out of surgery, she was stable enough to talk to them. What she told detectives was something out of a nightmare. Teresa explained that before the attack, her and Craig had been looking forward to spending the evening together. It had been a busy holiday season, and alone time had been hard to come by. But that night, it looked like they would finally get their chance. Both of Craig's daughters had ended up going to see their mothers. They decided to make the most of it by going out for dinner, after which they planned to just relax and enjoy each other's company. Teresa said that around 7:30 p.m. that night, they were standing in Craig's kitchen. They had a little time to pass before they went to dinner, so they were talking while Craig did a few things around the house. Everything was totally normal until suddenly a man she'd never seen before walked in through the unlocked garage door. The man was dressed in a black sweater with the hood pulled up over his head. He had a scruffy beard and a lazy eye and was carrying something in one of his hands. Teresa stated she didn't immediately realize that this was a gun because it was wrapped in tape and what appeared to her to be a bunch of random garbage. Once she realized how much danger they were in, she said she tried to call out, but it was like her body had completely shut down. She couldn't scream, she couldn't move, she was paralyzed with fear. Craig, meanwhile, was completely oblivious to all of this because he was in the pantry with his back turned. It was when he finally came out that all hell broke loose. Teresa said that as soon as she and Craig made eye contact, the unknown man raised his weapon and pointed it at her. He said a single word, bang, before he pulled the trigger. At first, Teresa couldn't even comprehend that she'd been shot. All she saw was what looked like a bunch of cotton flying everywhere before she felt a splitting pain in her forehead. Once the gunshots started, though, it was like they never stopped coming. Teresa fell to the floor, after which the shooter turned his weapon on Craig. She watched helplessly as he was hit in the leg and tried to run in a desperate attempt to make it to his own weapons that were stashed in his bedroom. Teresa was in unbearable pain, but she managed to get to her feet and escape from the house. On her way, she could hear Craig screaming upstairs. It destroyed her to leave him behind, but she knew the only chance for either one of them was for her to go and try and get help. She said she started banging on random doors until someone had opened up. Teresa's horrific first-hand account of the incident was invaluable to the investigation. She was also able to help police create a composite sketch of the shooter. Unfortunately, as I already mentioned, though, Teresa didn't actually know who this man was. On top of this, she was just as confused as anyone as to why all of this had happened. She said Craig was a wonderful person. They had started dating after meeting at a divorce support group a year earlier, and she had been blown away by what a great father he was to his girls. Speaking of Craig's daughters, Teresa told detectives something else pretty chilling, that the attack could have easily been far worse. Both girls were originally supposed to be with Craig that night. His 6-year-old daughter, Kristen, had been picked up by her mother, Elizabeth, earlier that day. And at the last minute, his 16-year-old daughter, Catherine, had flown out to Oregon to see her mother as well. Craig's 2 exes were some of the first people that police spoke to, both to notify them about the murder and to question them to see if there was anything that they knew. Particular attention was paid to Craig's second wife, Elizabeth. Elizabeth and Craig were in the middle of finalizing their divorce, and it was well known that the proceedings had been difficult. They had been separated for 2 years and had been involved in a lengthy custody dispute over their daughter, Kristen. However, both women seemed genuinely devastated by the news of Craig's death. Both also had solid alibis. Craig's first wife was halfway across the country, and Elizabeth had taken Kristen to visit extended family members about a 2-hour drive away in the city of Waco. Hoping to generate some new leads, authorities began canvassing Craig's neighborhood. They showed residents the composite sketch of the shooter, but no one had seen anyone matching the man's description. The tactic wasn't a complete waste of time, as police did learn something else important. Several people said they remembered seeing a dark-colored pickup truck parked at a vacant house nearby multiple times in the days leading up to the murder. This was interesting for a couple of reasons. First, the house in question was located just across from Craig's place, on the other side of a back alleyway that ran behind the properties there. Second, police had already discovered evidence related to the case in this area. There were several more .22 caliber shell casings scattered all over the place, as well as an empty can of beer. That wasn't all, though. While doing their initial sweep of Craig's property, officers had found light bulbs in the grass. They had been removed from the motion-detecting floodlights in Craig's backyard. Adding all of these details together, detectives came to an unsettling conclusion. Not only had Craig been specifically targeted, but whoever was responsible had been watching him and staking out his home without his knowledge for some time. These were all important developments, but once again, they didn't really point in any specific direction. Detectives had a whole bunch of clues, but it didn't feel like they were any closer to finding a suspect. Things would go on this way for nearly 2 weeks. Just when they were worried the investigation might be hitting a dead end, though, they received a call that would change everything. The person that had contacted police was a woman named Carol Salvato, and she said that she had information that she desperately needed to share with them about the murder of Craig Nale. Carol told detectives that a few days after the crime, she had gone to visit one of her friends. This friend had asked her to come over, and initially she seemed totally normal when they spoke on the phone. However, when Carol got there, her friend was acting super weird. She seemed nervous and suspicious, and even patted her down when she walked through the door. Once she was satisfied that Carol wasn't wearing any kind of recording device, she got straight to the point. She said she had a bag that she needed her to get rid of. It contained a bunch of receipts for weapons and ammunition, as well as several .22 caliber shell casings. The friend's name? It was Elizabeth Guthrie Nale, Craig's second wife. Carol said that Elizabeth could tell she was uncomfortable. While asking for her help, suddenly she just launched into this wild confession. Elizabeth admitted that she knew Craig was going to be murdered on the night of December 26th because she was the one that set it up. She said the divorce was about to be finalized and she had lost the house and full custody of her daughter Kristen. She was willing to do whatever it took to get Craig out of the way. Now, Carol didn't want any part of this, nor did she want to hear any of these details. But she told police once Elizabeth started talking, she just kept going and going. She explained that she had never met the person that carried out the actual shooting. She had hired the hitman through a mutual acquaintance and had only ever communicated with him through a cell phone. She said the cell phone was being kept in her mother's trailer so that investigators wouldn't find it if they searched her property, and her mom had been instructed to destroy it if police showed up. This was all hard enough for Carol to wrap her head around. She couldn't believe that her friend could be capable of something like this, but it was about to get even worse. Elizabeth stated that while the primary target of the deadly home invasion was Craig, the hitman had additional instructions. He was also supposed to make it look like Craig had killed Teresa before turning one of his guns on himself. In Elizabeth's words, Teresa needed to die too, along with anyone else who got in the way. This was an absolutely stunning admission. Remember, Craig's other daughter, Catherine, was originally going to be home as well that night, and Elizabeth knew that. In other words, she fully expected her 16-year-old stepdaughter to be murdered as well. With Carol's statement, police were able to obtain a search warrant for Elizabeth's mother's trailer. They executed this warrant carefully based on what she had told them, but it turned out they didn't have anything to worry about. The cell phone she was talking about was just sitting there out in the open, charging on a kitchen counter. When detectives checked the phone, they found cryptic messages between Elizabeth and the suspected hitman. The final message wished Carol a happy and long-lasting New Year and was signed GA. The contact associated with the number made it clear that GA stood for Guardian Angel. The number belonged to an unregistered burner phone, and at first investigators worried that this might be a problem. But as luck would have it, they discovered that minutes had recently been purchased and added to the phone at a local Walmart. Surveillance footage at the store was grainy, but the man who made the transaction appeared to match the description of the shooter Teresa had given them. Video from the parking lot made them even more confident. The man was driving a dark-colored pickup truck, just like the one Craig's neighbors had seen in the days leading up to the crime. The footage wasn't clear enough to make out a license plate or anything, but once again, police were fortunate. The truck had distinctive flame decals stenciled on the side, and when they looked at the burner cell phone's records, all the activity had happened within a few miles of this Walmart. They were fairly sure that the suspect lived close by. Authorities were correct, and after a couple of days of searching, they located both the truck and its owner. It belonged to a 52-year-old man named Mark Lyle Bell. Mark was a career criminal, one who had spent a good chunk of his life behind bars. He was no stranger to breaking into homes, and was a near-perfect match to the composite sketch, down to the lazy eye that Teresa had mentioned. Following Mark's arrest, he attempted to play dumb, saying that he'd never met Craig Nail before and had no idea what police were talking about. But that soon changed when they revealed they'd done a search of Mark's truck. Inside was a spent .22 caliber shell casing, the exact same type that had been found at the crime scene. There were also empty beer cans of the same brand that investigators found in that back alleyway near the vacant home. Testing showed that the .22 caliber casing in Mark's truck and the ones inside Craig's home had all come from rounds that were fired by the same gun, and DNA analysis proved that Mark drank from all of the cans of beer that they had recovered. When confronted with this evidence, Mark confessed that he'd been hired by Elizabeth to commit the murder through a man named Thomas Edward Grace. He'd been promised between $5,000 and $7,000 to commit the crime, and like Carol Salvato told police, he'd been instructed to kill everyone inside Craig's home. Mark also helped to clear up a couple of other unanswered questions about the crime scene, specifically concerning that cotton detectives found everywhere and Carol's strange description of the murder weapon. Mark said he'd constructed a homemade silencer by stuffing a water bottle full of gauze and other cotton-like materials. He'd fastened the bottle to the end of his handgun with a whole bunch of tape, and had also attached a plastic garbage bag to the side. His intention was for the bag to catch the shell casings as they were ejected from the gun, but the setup hadn't worked as planned. The hot casings had burned through the bag and fallen out all over the place, which is why police had discovered them scattered in the alleyway as well. Mark explained that he'd watched Craig for weeks ahead of the crime, using the vacant house and the alleyway as a stakeout point. He had removed the bulbs from the lights in the backyard ahead of time so that no one would notice him sneaking across the property and towards the garage door. As for the beer, he said he drank it to build up his nerve to go through with the plan. As awful as all of this was, it was the final detail that Mark shared with detectives that was perhaps the most unsettling. He stated he hadn't killed Craig Nale for the money. Instead, he claimed he did it out of principle. When they asked him what he meant, Craig said Elizabeth told him and Thomas Grace that Craig had been abusing his daughter, Kristen. Now, police were actually familiar with this claim because this wasn't the first time it had come up. You see, Elizabeth had previously made this accusation during her and Craig's divorce proceedings. This had been investigated fully, but there was absolutely no evidence to substantiate it. Instead, Elizabeth had made it all up, believing it would help her win custody. The story hadn't worked in court, but it had worked on her accomplices. This is where things get a bit weird. Most of the sources we came across in our research didn't delve much into how Elizabeth managed to get in contact with a person like Mark Bell, other than that Thomas Grace was an intermediary. However, a couple of sources did mention that Elizabeth had been hanging around with bikers in the lead up to the crime, specifically some that were affiliated with Bikers Against Child Abuse. This is a group that bills itself as a charitable motorcycle organization that works to protect children across the world. As far as we can tell, the group has a presence throughout North America, as well as a number of European countries, though their reputation seems to be pretty mixed. Regardless, it appears that Elizabeth cynically took advantage of the group's mission, feeding members lies about Craig until she found people that were willing to do what she wanted. Elizabeth and Thomas Grace were both arrested around the same time as Mark Bell. Mark and Thomas both quickly took plea deals, with Mark pleading guilty to capital murder and other offenses, while Thomas pleaded guilty to conspiracy to commit aggravated assault. Elizabeth initially decided to take her chances in court, but as soon as prosecutors started putting witnesses like Teresa and Mark on the stand, she changed her mind. On the third day of testimony, she took a deal and pleaded guilty to conspiracy to commit capital murder. In the sentencing hearing that followed, Craig's devastated loved ones expressed their anger and grief about just how much had been taken from them that December night in 2008. Teresa had found someone she thought she could spend the rest of her life with. Instead, she was left with a daily reminder of the horror she experienced in her and Craig's final moments together. A reminder that came in the form of permanent injuries, including nearly 24 bullet fragments in her face that doctors were never able to remove. Craig's daughter, Catherine, talked about how she went from being a happy teenager and straight-A student to a high school dropout who made multiple attempts on her own life. Thankfully, according to more recent interviews, it seems she has since been able to get her life back on track, something she credits to wanting to honor her father's memory. Though it's still heartbreaking to hear what she went through. Then there was Kristen, who was too young to advocate for herself at the time, but who arguably lost both her mother and her father as a result of Elizabeth's actions. In the end, Thomas Grace was sentenced to 8 years in prison, while Mark Bell was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Elizabeth, meanwhile, was sentenced to 50 years in prison. At the time of this recording, she remains incarcerated at the Dr. Lane Murray Unit in Gatesville, Texas. She will be eligible for parole in early 2033, though her projected release date is listed as January of 2058.
Before we wrap up, we'd like to take a second to give a huge shout out to everyone who has made it this far into the video. Seriously, thank you so much for watching. If you found today's upload interesting and informative, we'd be honored if you'd consider liking and subscribing, as well as hitting the notification bell and selecting all notifications to stay up to date with our latest releases. If you're looking for additional ways to help support the channel, we'd love to have you join us over on Patreon. Patrons get ad-free and early access to all of our content, as well as 4 additional stories per week for each of our Crimes of the Week and Crimes of the Week International videos. You can learn more at patreon.com/crimezone, where you'll also find some of the fine folks whose names are currently on screen. All that being said, we understand that not everyone has the means to support financially, and that's totally okay. We appreciate every like, sub, share, and comment that you send our way. Once again, thanks so much everyone, and take care.